Okay, so going on with this Friedman article. So, in essence, this Friedman article, it's I don't view Friedman as some sort of a nutcase. He genuinely believes in what he's saying. He is coming from a perspective of a European immigrant, and he genuinely believes that the force of American empire is a force for good across the world. This is what he believes. Now, I happen to differ from his belief, but let him speak his mind so that I can point out perhaps some of the contradictions in what he has to say. He says that the geography of the American empire was built partly on military relations, um, but heavily on economic relations. First of all, it has nothing to do with geography. But at first, these economic relations were fairly trivial to American business. So I would have to differ right there. Okay, these relations were always important to American business, contrary to what George Friedman has to say. But as the system matured, the value of investment soared, along with the importance of imports, export, and labor markets. As in any genuinely successful empire, he goes on to say, it did not begin with a grand design or even a dream of one. No, we couldn't have that. It strategic necessity created an economic reality in country after country until certain major industries became dependent on at least some countries. In other words, they were not made dependent, these countries were not made dependent on America's benevolence across the globe. No, it was a strategic necessity for these countries to be saved from themselves, presumably. The obvious examples, he says, were Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, whose oil-fueled American oil companies, uh, and which therefore, quite apart from conventional strategic importance, became economically important. What does he mean by conventional strategic importance? Of course, oil. If your entire country and its economics are based uh, on an oil-based economy, then of course it is strategically important. It didn't just fall into anyone's lap by accident. So then he goes on and he finally admits, so this eventually made them strategically important. Now, I have to add here that this went on way before 1945. So it isn't as if the American economy all of a sudden was completely independent of any oil producing countries before 1945. Although it must be added that America produced its own oil for a very long time, but it soon, the Arabian Peninsula became increasingly important. Yes, and so did Venezuela with its massive oil supplies. I have to scroll down here to see what I'm reading. Uh, as an empire matures, he says, its economic value increases, particularly when it's not coercing others. In other words, none of the events that happened in Central and South America were had anything to do with coercion. Coercion is expensive and undermines the worth of empire. The ideal colony is one that is not at all a colony, but a nation that benefits from economic relations with both the imperial power and the rest of the empire. For some reason, the people of these countries that actually reside in these colonies were never asked. Third, third, well, I'm skipping here, but the primary military relationship ought to be either mutual dependence or, barring that, dependence of the vulnerable client state on the imperial power. So the economic elites in Central and South America had absolutely nothing to do with this projection of power. It was actually our power, the United States power, was entirely benevolent or a beneficiary to these countries and their populations, which I would highly question. This is how the United States slipped into empire, he says. First, it was overwhelmingly wealthy and powerful. Second, it faced a potential adversary. Potential is not even underlined, capable of challenging it globally in a large number of countries. And third, it used its economic advantage to induce at least some of these countries into economic and therefore political and military relationships. Fourth, these countries became significantly important to various sectors of the American economy. So essentially, George Friedman is admitting that our economy, more or less, is based on the exploitation of others. He doesn't say this in so many words, but this is the reality. He then goes on to talk about limits of the American empire and how you can't project your power everywhere. He goes on to say the basic Cold War principle prevailed, and that there was a coalition between with the United States at the center of this whole thing, and that after 9/11, the decision was made to fight in Afghanistan and in Iraq with this core model in place. In other words, the Cold War model. And it was assumed that the economic benefits of relations with the United States would be self-evident. Well, evidently for some populations in other countries, that was not self-evident, but Friedman skips right over that. And then he goes on to say that no empire can endure by direct rule. And this is very important to understand what he is saying here, because he's dead serious. The Nazis were perhaps the best example of this, he says. I would probably question that, but they tried to govern Poland directly, captured Soviet territory, pushed aside Vichy to govern not half but all of France, and so on. The British, on the other hand, ruled India with a thin layer of officials and officers and a large cadre of businessmen trying to make their fortunes. So, has anything changed? Yeah. The British obviously did better. The Germans exhausted themselves not only by overreaching, but also by diverting troops and administrators to directly oversee some countries. Well, actually, yes, in some smaller regions that was the case, but you know, this is also skewed. Uh, the Germans broke themselves not only on their enemies but on their conquests as well. It's almost as if Friedman is lamenting the intransience of all of this, that somehow I don't even want to go there, but the United States emerged after 1992. So this is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the only global balanced power. And by balanced, of course, there isn't any global balanced power, since Friedman admits that the United States is the power, right? But what he's trying to address here is he feels that there's a balance because it the balance consists of American dominance, in that it can deploy economic, political, and military power on a global basis. And he makes no qualms about this. This is supposed to be the status quo across the globe and to be maintained at virtually any cost, as long as it doesn't become internally, politically, here in the United States, too expensive. And as long as public opinion doesn't turn against these very policies. And of course, the American media, in conjunction, I might add, with a lot of social media and alternative websites, are also pushing that very same narrative today. So I'm not going to read the rest of this. He goes on to the responsibilities of empire, and he goes on to say that he keeps on saying that the United States never intended to become an empire. It was just kind of by accident. And but there are limits to that empire, and that those have to be recognized, and there will be challenges to it. But the only way to prevail is essentially by convincing um, as many countries as possible that this is the right path to go on, and that these neoliberal policies, which are being essentially imposed across the globe, are the way to go, and that there really is no other alternative. This is what George Friedman thinks. He's totally convinced of this. Um, he and other think tanks have an enormous influence on European foreign policy, if you can even call anything there cohesive at all. But it is very important to recognize that the American empire, as he readily admits, will look out for itself first and foremost. And as I'll show you in the next article that he wrote and others contributed to, um, the alliances can shift between the relations of the American empire and who is to be the future friend and the future foe, depending on who benefits, as long as it is the presumably what he thinks the American populace. Only he hasn't realized that the American populace is probably also no longer okay with this, since our own living standards are not only decreasing by leaps and bounds, but that an expectation has been raised within American society and throughout the West, as a matter of fact, that we have unlimited supplies of goods and unlimited supplies of services at our very whim, when all of these policies are essentially detrimental to our environment and we are trashing the planet. This is not at all addressed by George Friedman and cohorts. I'll probably make another few, I have other articles by him, by the way, which are equally important, because you need to understand where these people are coming from. Probably not tonight, maybe tomorrow. We'll see. Anyway, good night for now, and thanks for listening.